You know the story. Everyone knows the story. A 3-year-old boy sits in a pool of his mother's blood inside a shipping container on the Miami docks. A cop named Harry Morgan opens that container, sees the boy, and carries him out, adopts him, raises him, gives him a code to live by. And for 8 seasons of television, we accepted that story as gospel. Harry Morgan saved Dexter. Harry Morgan was the hero. The show told us this story 100 different ways. Through flashbacks, through Harry's ghost appearing at Dexter's side, guiding him, coaching him, reminding him of the rules. Through the warm filter of memory that made Harry's face look fatherly instead of frightened. Through every time Dexter thought back to his childhood and saw a dad teaching his son how to survive in a world that wasn't built for him. We absorbed this narrative so deeply that questioning it felt almost ungrateful, like second-guessing the one good thing that happened in a story full of terrible things. But what if we've been watching the wrong story this whole time? What if Harry Morgan didn't rescue Dexter from becoming a monster? What if he guaranteed it? What if the man we've been told was a loving father was actually something far more complicated, far more culpable, and far more disturbing than any of the killers Dexter ever strapped to a table? That's the first of 8 theories we're going to walk through tonight. 8 of the darkest, most disturbing fan theories in the entire Dexter universe. Each one is grounded in actual canon, pulled from real episodes, cross-referenced with confirmed details from the original series, New Blood, Original Sin, and Resurrection. Nothing here is made up, nothing here is speculation without evidence. Every theory tonight is built on things the show actually told us, things we maybe weren't paying close enough attention to. These aren't ranked by darkness. They're ordered by logic. Each theory builds on the one before it. And by the time we reach the 8th and final theory, every piece will connect into a single picture that might change how you see the entire franchise. The first theory asks who Harry really was. The second asks what the dark passenger really is. The 3rd through 6th examine the people who were destroyed by the system Harry and Vogel built. The 7th follows the system into its next generation. And the 8th asks the question that ties everything together. The one that should have been asked from the very beginning, but never was. So settle in, get comfortable, and if you're enjoying this breakdown, make sure to subscribe before we get started so you don't miss the next one. The theories we're covering tonight span the entire Dexter franchise. The original series, all 8 seasons, New Blood, Original Sin, Resurrection. Every piece of the puzzle contributes to the picture we're about to build. If you've only seen part of the franchise, don't worry, I'll give you everything you need to follow along. If you've seen all of it, prepare to see it differently. Because the connections between these theories aren't coincidental, they're structural. The show built them in, whether the writers intended to or not, and once you see them, you can't unsee them. Let's begin. Harry Morgan is the foundation of everything in the Dexter universe. Without Harry, there is no code. Without the code, there is no Dexter. At least not the version of Dexter we know. And for the first several seasons of the show, the narrative frames Harry as a tragic hero, a good cop, a loving father who found himself in an impossible situation and did the best he could with a damaged child. But go back and actually trace Harry's decisions from the beginning. Not the version Harry told Dexter, not the version Dexter tells himself. The actual decisions in order as they happened, and a very different picture starts to emerge. It starts with Laura Moser, Dexter's biological mother. Laura was a confidential informant working for Harry Morgan inside a drug cartel run by Hector Estrada. That part is confirmed across multiple seasons and explored in detail during Original Sin. What's also confirmed, and what changes everything about how you interpret Harry's character, is that Harry was sleeping with Laura while she was his informant. He was having an affair with a woman whose safety depended entirely on him. And Harry wasn't just sleeping with Laura. Original Sin confirms that Harry had relationships with multiple informants. He was married to Doris Morgan, who was dying of cancer at the time, and he was carrying on affairs with the women he was supposed to be protecting. Laura begged Harry to pull her out. She told him it was getting too dangerous, that the cartel was getting suspicious. Harry refused. He kept her in place, and the cartel found out. Hector Estrada discovered that Laura was a CI, and he had her brought to a shipping container on the docks. Santos Jimenez, one of Estrada's enforcers, chainsawed Laura to death in front of her 2 sons. Dexter was 3 years old. His brother Brian was 4. Both children were left sitting in their mother's blood until Harry Morgan arrived at the scene. Now here's where the story takes the turn that nobody thinks about carefully enough. Harry Morgan arrived at that shipping container. He looked at both boys. He picked up Dexter, and he left Brian behind. He looked at a 4-year-old child, decided that child was already too far gone, and walked away. Brian Moser was sent to a psychiatric institution. Harry never checked on him, never told Dexter he had a brother. In Season 1, we learned that Harry actively destroyed medical records connecting Dexter to Brian. He erased the connection entirely, and Brian grew up alone in that institution, forgotten by everyone, and eventually became the ice truck killer. The first serial killer Dexter ever had to face was his own brother, a brother he didn't even know existed, because Harry decided at the scene of their mother's murder that one boy was worth saving and the other wasn't. Think about that for a second. Harry Morgan made a judgment call about a 4-year-old. He looked into a child's eyes and decided he saw something broken beyond repair. A child who had just watched his mother get dismembered. And instead of getting that child help, instead of taking both boys, instead of doing literally anything, Harry left Brian in the system and pretended he didn't exist. So already, before the code, before any of it, Harry's track record is this. He got Laura killed by keeping her undercover when she wanted out. He abandoned one of her children, and he took the other one home, not necessarily out of love, but possibly out of guilt. Because Harry knew on some level that everything that happened in that shipping container was his fault. Original Sin lays this out with painful clarity. In the flashback sequences, we see Laura meeting Harry at a park, trying to convey the danger she's in. We see Santos Jimenez watching them from a distance. We see the night Laura, Dexter, and Brian are ambushed at her house, subdued by Jimenez and his men, dragged to the shipyard, locked in a container with other intended victims. Estrada arrives and tells Laura how disappointed he is in her betrayal. And then Jimenez fires up the chainsaw. Laura tries to cover her children's eyes. She tries to shield them from what's about to happen. But little Dexter looks, he watches, and what he sees in that container becomes the foundation of everything that follows. Harry and his partner Bobby arrive at Laura's house after the fact. They find it empty, signs of a struggle. By the time they reach the container, Laura is dead, both boys are traumatized beyond anything a child should ever experience, and Harry Morgan is looking at the consequences of every decision he made. Every late night with a woman he was supposed to protect. Every time he chose to keep Laura in place instead of pulling her out. Every risk he took with someone else's life to advance his own career or satisfy his own needs. And from that guilt, from that terrible, crushing knowledge that he was responsible for what happened in that container, Harry Morgan made a decision that would echo through decades. He would take Dexter, he would raise Dexter, and he would make Dexter into something that would justify what happened. If Dexter was broken, if Dexter was a monster, if Dexter was always going to be a killer, then what happened in the container wasn't Harry's fault. It was fate. It was destiny. Dexter was damaged goods from birth, and Harry was just managing the inevitable. That's the psychology of what Harry did. He needed Dexter to be a psychopath. Because if Dexter was a normal, traumatized child who could have been helped with therapy and love and patience, then Harry Morgan wasn't a hero who saved a broken boy. He was the man who broke the boy in the first place by getting his mother killed. And this is where the theory really starts to build, because what Harry did next wasn't therapy, it wasn't rescue, it was something else entirely. When young Dexter started showing signs of violent behavior, killing animals, exhibiting a lack of emotional response, Harry had a choice. Any responsible parent would take their child to a psychologist, get a professional evaluation, explore treatment options. Harry did the opposite. He consulted Dr. Evelyn Vogel, a neuropsychiatrist who had built her entire career studying psychopaths, not treating them, studying them. And together, Harry and Vogel decided, without a formal clinical diagnosis, without a second opinion, without ever giving Dexter a real chance at conventional therapy, that Dexter was a psychopath who would inevitably kill. They didn't test this hypothesis, they assumed it. And then they built an entire system around that assumption. In Season 2, Episode 4, there's a detail that gets overlooked constantly. Harry coached young Dexter to lie during a psychological evaluation. He sat with Dexter beforehand, told him exactly what to say, and afterward, when the doctor failed to identify anything wrong, Harry's response wasn't relief, it was confirmation. He told Dexter something along the lines of, "It's working, keep doing it. That doctor didn't even see the monster inside you." Harry actively prevented Dexter from receiving legitimate mental health treatment. He pulled Dexter out of the one environment where he might have actually been helped and replaced it with his own system. And that system was the code. Now the code gets talked about like it's this noble, creative solution. Harry channeling Dexter's darkness into something productive, turning a potential monster into a vigilante. But strip away the mythology and look at what the code actually is. It has two core rules: don't get caught, and only kill people who deserve it. Those aren't therapeutic principles, those are operational security protocols. Don't get caught is the first rule of every covert operative, every intelligence agent, every criminal who wants to stay out of prison. Harry didn't teach Dexter to manage his impulses, he taught him to manage his exposure. The code isn't a treatment plan, it's a manual for getting away with murder. And Harry didn't stop at theory, he put it into practice. During Original Sin, we see Harry directing Dexter's early kills. When Dexter identifies Nurse Mary, a woman who was poisoning patients at a hospital, Harry doesn't report her to the authorities. He doesn't call the police. He doesn't do any of the things a cop is supposed to do. Instead, he encourages his teenage adopted son to kill her. The same thing happens with Tony Ferrer, a loan shark responsible for multiple deaths. Harry had the evidence. He could have made an arrest. Instead, he pointed Dexter at the target and let him pull the trigger. When Juan Rennes was released from prison, Harry subtly directed Dexter to kill him too. This is confirmed on the Villainous Benchmark Wiki with episode citations from Original Sin. Harry Morgan, a sergeant in the Miami Metro Police Department, was using his adopted son as a personal executioner. He was outsourcing murder to a teenager and calling it therapy. And here's the part that ties it all together. Harry eventually saw the full picture of what he had built. There's a scene referenced across multiple seasons, discussed explicitly in Season 8, Episode 4, where Harry walked in on adult Dexter in the middle of a kill. Plastic everywhere, blood everywhere, Dexter dismembering a human body with practiced efficiency. And Harry, the man who created the code, the man who trained Dexter from childhood, looked at what his son had become and couldn't live with it. Harry Morgan committed suicide. His death was covered up as heart failure, but the truth comes out later in the series. Deborah asked Dexter directly if Harry killed himself, and Dexter confirms it. He did, because he thought he had created a monster. Those are Dexter's own words. Season 8, Episode 4. Harry took his own life because he finally understood what he had done. But here's the thing about Harry's suicide that nobody talks about. It wasn't redemption. It wasn't a noble act of a tortured father who couldn't bear the weight of his decisions. Harry killed himself to escape. He saw what he built, and instead of trying to undo it, instead of telling Dexter the truth, instead of getting him real help even at that late stage, Harry checked out. He left Dexter alone with the code and the dark passenger, and no one to tell him that any of it could have been different. And the evidence that it could have been different is everywhere in the show. This is maybe the most important part of this entire theory. Throughout 8 seasons, Dexter Morgan develops genuine emotional bonds. He loves Rita, genuinely loves her. His grief when she dies is not performed, not calculated, not the mimicry of a psychopath pretending to feel. It's real. He loves Harrison with a fierceness that drives the entire plot of multiple seasons. He loves Deb so deeply that her death destroys him. He forms real connections with Lumen, with Hannah, even with Brian in their brief time together. A true psychopath cannot form these attachments. That's not an opinion. That's clinical psychology. Psychopathy is characterized by the inability to form genuine emotional bonds, and Dexter forms them constantly, which means one of two things is true. Either Dexter was never actually a psychopath, or he had the capacity for emotional connection all along and Harry's conditioning suppressed it rather than nurtured it. In Season 7, Episode 10, there's a moment that should have changed everything. Dexter has a conversation with Harry's ghost about the dark passenger. And Dexter says something revealing. He says, "If there's no dark passenger, then I'm responsible for everything I've done." And Harry's ghost responds with the most important line in the entire series. "It sure is a whole lot simpler to just pin all the blame on something else, isn't it, Dexter? It's much scarier to think that the dark passenger is no more real than I am. The dark passenger might not be real." The thing that drove Dexter to kill for over a decade might just be a story. A narrative framework that Harry and Vogel installed in a traumatized child to make their system work. And if that's true, then the Dark Passenger isn't Dexter's demon, it's Harry's creation. A psychological construct designed to give Dexter permission to do what Harry trained him to do while absolving Harry of responsibility for the results. In Resurrection, Dexter prioritizes saving a potential victim over making a kill. The show makes a point of noting that this is something Dexter has never done before. His empathy, his capacity for genuine moral choice, was always there. Harry trained it out of him, layer by layer, kill by kill, year by year. Until Dexter believed so completely that he was a monster that he couldn't see any other version of himself. Screen Rant published an analysis in 2021 arguing that Dexter's traits align more closely with PTSD from his mother's murder and antisocial personality disorder than with clinical psychopathy. Neither of those conditions directly indicates a predisposition to murder. Dexter wasn't born broken, he was broken by what happened in that shipping container. And instead of being put back together, he was reshaped into something useful by a guilty cop who couldn't face what he'd done. Harry Morgan didn't save Dexter from the shipping container, he carried him out of one container and put him into another. A container made of rules and rituals, and the unshakable belief that he was a monster who could never be anything else. Harry didn't channel Dexter's darkness, he built it, brick by brick, kill by kill. And when he finally saw what he'd constructed, he couldn't live with it. But Dexter had to. Before we move on to the next theory, make sure to subscribe if you're enjoying this breakdown. We've got 7 more to go, and they only get darker from here. So let's talk about the Dark Passenger, because if Theory 1 is that Harry manufactured Dexter's identity as a killer, then Theory 2 asks a much bigger question. What if the thing that drives Dexter to kill isn't just inside him? What if it's been spreading? In 2007, Jeff Lindsay published the 3rd Dexter novel, called Dexter in the Dark. In that book, Lindsay did something that divided the fan base completely. He revealed that the Dark Passenger wasn't a metaphor, it wasn't a psychological condition, it was an actual supernatural entity. An offspring of the ancient god Moloch that had attached itself to Dexter. Fans hated it. Critics called it a misstep. Lindsay himself later referred to the entire concept as an experiment and dropped the supernatural angle from all future novels. The TV show, which had already diverged significantly from the books, ignored the idea entirely and treated the Dark Passenger as purely psychological. But here's the thing, what if both interpretations are partially right? What if the Dark Passenger isn't literally a demon, but it also isn't just garden variety trauma? What if it's something in between? A hereditary psychic imprint, a pattern of violence that passes from parent to child through exposure to extreme trauma, growing stronger and more defined with each generation it infects? Look at the evidence the show gives us. Laura Moser was chainsawed to death inside a shipping container. 2 children witnessed it. Both of those children, Dexter and Brian, developed what the show calls a dark passenger. Brian became the ice truck killer. Dexter became the Bay Harbor butcher. 2 sons. Same trauma, same result. Different expressions, but the same fundamental outcome. Both became serial killers. The parallel between Dexter and Brian is the strongest piece of evidence for the hereditary trauma theory. Brian and Dexter were separated as children. They had no contact. They didn't share an upbringing. Brian went to a psychiatric institution. Dexter went to Harry's house. They received completely different environments, completely different influences, completely different opportunities, and both became serial killers. Brian's method was theatrical. He drained his victims of blood. He dismembered them with surgical precision. He left their body parts arranged in deliberate patterns. The ice truck killer's signature was sterile, organized, almost clinical. And when Brian finally reveals himself to Dexter in the season 1 finale, he says something that cuts to the heart of this theory. He tells Dexter that he remembers everything about the shipping container, that he remembers the blood, that he remembers what it felt like to sit in their mother's remains. Brian didn't suppress the memory the way Dexter did. He carried it with him, fully conscious, for his entire life. And it shaped him into exactly what you would expect. Harry chose Dexter and left Brian behind. He decided one boy was salvageable and the other wasn't. And the boy he abandoned became a killer without any training, without any code, without any framework. Brian became the ice truck killer purely through the raw processing of unaddressed trauma, which raises an uncomfortable question. If Brian became a killer without the code, does that prove Harry was right to create it for Dexter? Or does it prove the opposite, that the killing impulse came from the trauma, not from any innate darkness, and that proper therapy might have prevented it in both boys? Now fast forward to season 4. Rita Morgan is murdered by Arthur Mitchell, the Trinity killer. She's found in a bathtub, bled out, and sitting in her blood is her infant son, Harrison. The imagery is deliberate. The show frames it as a mirror image of what happened to Dexter in the shipping container. A child sitting in the blood of a murdered parent, absorbing something that will define the rest of their life. And what happens to Harrison? In New Blood, Dexter finds a straight razor hidden inside a flashlight among Harrison's belongings. Deb's ghost, which functions as Dexter's conscience in New Blood, tells Dexter that Harrison was born in blood and has inherited the dark passenger. Harrison develops violent urges. He gets into altercations. He shows the same pattern of controlled aggression that defined Dexter's youth. And eventually, in Resurrection, Harrison begins committing his own kills. But the pattern with Harrison goes deeper than surface-level urges. Look at what happens at the school in Iron Lake. Ethan, a bullied classmate, is planning something violent. Harrison intervenes. The official story is that Ethan stabbed Harrison first, and Harrison tackled him to disarm him, accidentally cutting Ethan's leg so badly he nearly bled out. That's what Harrison tells the police. That's what everyone accepts. But Dexter, the forensic analyst, examines the crime scene photos and realizes the stab wound doesn't match Harrison's story. The angle is wrong. The sequence of events doesn't add up. Something happened in that room that Harrison isn't telling anyone about. When Dexter confronts Harrison about it, Harrison gets defensive, tells Dexter to stop interrogating him, changes the subject. It's textbook. It's exactly what Dexter would have done at that age if someone questioned his version of events. Harrison is already constructing cover stories, already managing his narrative, already doing the thing that the code's first rule demands: don't get caught, without anyone having taught him the rule. The behavior is replicating on its own, through trauma, not through instruction. Harrison's sketchbook, which his friends discover when they rifle through his bag at the abandoned Roaring Fork summer camp, reveals a side of him he keeps hidden. His emotional volatility, his isolation, his ability to charm when he needs to and withdraw when he doesn't. All of it mirrors a young Dexter with uncanny precision. For Cronin, the question the show raises isn't whether Harrison is dangerous, it's whether the pattern of trauma-created violence can ever produce a different result, or whether every child who sits in a parent's blood is destined to become some version of the person who put them there. The pattern transmitted. Laura to Dexter and Brian, Rita to Harrison, 3 generations, 3 sets of killers. But it doesn't stop with the Morgan family line. Look at the Mitchells. Arthur Mitchell, the Trinity killer, appeared to the outside world as a normal family man. Coached Little League, built houses for charity through his 4 Walls, 1 Heart Foundation. But inside the Mitchell household, Arthur was a tyrant. He physically and psychologically abused his wife Sally, his son Jonah, and his daughter Rebecca for decades. And what happened to Arthur's children? His daughter Christine became a killer. She shot FBI Special Agent Frank Lundy and Deborah Morgan in season 4. The show reveals Christine's connection to Arthur gradually. Deb is recovering from the shooting, trying to piece together what happened, when she realizes something that had been nagging at her. At a family dinner, Cody innocently asks Deb about her scars, and as she recounts watching Lundy die, a detail clicks into place. Christine Hill, Quinn's girlfriend, a reporter who had been covering the case, had mentioned specific details about Lundy's death that were never released to the public. Christine knew that Deb watched Lundy die. How could a reporter know that? The answer is sickening. Christine didn't read about it. She was there. She pulled the trigger. And later that same night, Arthur shows up at Christine's apartment. She opens the door expecting Quinn, and instead finds her father glaring at her. She just looks at him and says, "Hey, Dad," like it's the most normal thing in the world to have the Trinity killer show up at your door after you've just shot a federal agent to protect his identity. Christine killed because that's what the Mitchell family produces. Arthur's violence transmitted to her, not through genetics, but through a lifetime of existing inside his orbit. She internalized his worldview. She understood that violence solves problems, that protecting the family means doing whatever it takes, including murder. Jonah, Arthur's son, who endured years of beatings and terror, eventually committed murder himself. Jonah tries to be different. He stands up to Arthur at the dinner table. He urges his mother to leave. He sees clearly what his family is and wants to escape. But when Arthur dies and the family structure collapses, Sally turns on Jonah. She blames him for not stopping Arthur. The abuse continues even after the abuser is dead. It just finds a new direction. And Jonah breaks under it. The son, who wanted to be good, who tried to resist the pattern, is eventually consumed by it anyway. The pattern repeated inside the Mitchell family exactly as it repeated inside the Morgan family. Abuse, trauma, exposure to violence, and then the emergence of violent behavior in the next generation. Now look at Dr. Evelyn Vogel. Vogel dedicated her entire career to studying psychopaths. She literally wrote the book on psychopathic behavior. She helped create the Code of Harry. She understood the mechanics of violent psychology better than anyone else in the show's universe. And her own biological son, Daniel Vogel, became a serial killer. Daniel, who later operated under the alias Oliver Saxon and was known as the Brain Surgeon, murdered multiple people in season 8. Vogel, the woman who understood the transmission of violent behavior better than any character in the franchise, couldn't prevent it from happening in her own family. Her son drowned his own brother Richard when they were children, and Vogel covered it up as an accident. Every family in the Dexter universe that experiences violence produces the next generation of violence. The Mosers, the Morgans, the Mitchells, the Vogels. The pattern is consistent. It's not genetic in the traditional sense because these families don't all share DNA. What they share is exposure, proximity to violence at critical developmental stages. And that exposure creates the dark passenger. Go back to that conversation in Season 7, Episode 10. Harry's ghost suggests that the dark passenger might be no more real than I am. And earlier in the same conversation, Harry tells Dexter something crucial. Dexter says, "You said it got into me too early, in that shipping container, like you thought I was possessed." And Harry responds, "I meant you were traumatized, Dexter, not possessed. Traumatized, not possessed." If the dark passenger is a trauma response rather than a fixed neurological condition, then it can be transmitted, not through genetics, through exposure. A child who witnesses their mother's murder doesn't inherit a gene for violence. They absorb a pattern, a template for how the world works, a blueprint that tells them that violence is normal, that darkness is inevitable, that the only question isn't whether you'll hurt someone, but when and how. And here's where the theory becomes truly disturbing. If the dark passenger is a trauma pattern that replicates through exposure, then Harry's code didn't manage it. The code fed it. Every kill Dexter made reinforced the pattern. Every victim he strapped to a table, every blood slide he collected, every ritual he performed strengthened the dark passenger's hold. The code wasn't treatment, it was exercise. It was keeping the pattern sharp, trained, and hungry. Laura's murder infected Dexter and Brian. Rita's murder infected Harrison. Arthur Mitchell's abuse infected Jonah and Christine. Vogel's dysfunction infected Daniel. The pattern keeps spreading, keeps finding new hosts, keeps creating new killers. And the most terrifying implication of this theory is that the dark passenger doesn't need a supernatural origin to be terrifying. It doesn't need to be an ancient god. It doesn't need to be Moloch. Trauma is supernatural enough. It passes from generation to generation. It changes shape to fit its host. It whispers different things to different people, but always drives them toward the same destination. And the people who try to control it, Harry with his code, Vogel with her research, Arthur with his rituals, they all end up feeding it instead. The dark passenger isn't dying, it's evolving. And somewhere in some version of the Dexter universe, it's settling into its newest host, whispering the same words it whispered to Dexter, to Brian, to Harrison, to every damaged child who ever sat in someone else's blood and learned that this is what the world is made of. Before we move on, make sure that subscribe button is hit. Trust me, you're going to want to hear what comes next. Let's talk about the one person in the entire Dexter universe who got it right. The one person who saw Dexter Morgan for exactly what he was from the very first day and was rewarded for being right by being framed as a serial killer and blown up in a cabin in the Everglades. Let's talk about Sergeant James Doakes. The show wants you to think of Doakes as the angry cop, the aggressive, confrontational bulldog who couldn't let things go. Every scene with Doakes is framed to make him look unreasonable. He's always in Dexter's face, always pushing, always hostile. The audience is conditioned to root for Dexter and to see Doakes as an obstacle, a nuisance, someone who needs to be dealt with so the protagonist can get on with his life. But strip away the show's framing for a second. Forget that Dexter is the main character, forget the sympathetic voiceover, forget the dark humor and the charming sociopathy. Look at the raw facts of what Doakes did and what happened to him. Doakes was a decorated military veteran with special forces experience. He'd spent years in combat zones. He understood violence on an instinctive level. And from the moment he met Dexter Morgan, something set off every alarm in his body. He told Dexter directly, "You creep me out." He said, "I see the way you look at these crime scenes. You get off on it." Both of those statements were factually accurate. Dexter was a serial killer. Dexter did derive satisfaction from crime scenes. Doakes wasn't being paranoid, he was being observant. While every other detective in Miami Metro treated Dexter as a harmless lab geek, the quiet, blood spatter guy who kept to himself and brought donuts to the office, Doakes trusted his instincts. He followed Dexter, he surveilled him, he confronted him repeatedly. He put himself at personal and professional risk because he believed, correctly, that something was deeply wrong with Dexter Morgan, and every single thing Doakes suspected turned out to be true. Dexter was the Bay Harbor butcher. Dexter was killing people and dumping their body parts in the ocean. Dexter was using Miami Metro's databases and forensic resources to identify and stalk his victims. Everything Doakes said, every accusation he made, every warning he tried to raise was vindicated by the facts. There's a flashback scene that captures the dynamic perfectly. Dexter brings donuts to the station, casual, friendly, blending in. He offers one to Doakes, and Doakes snaps at him. But it's not random aggression. Doakes is angry at himself about something else. And Dexter, trying to be helpful, gives him advice and quotes a phrase he'd seen in a journal. The problem is the journal belonged to a murder suspect. When Doakes asks Dexter how he knows the quote, Dexter fumbles the answer, and that's the moment. That's the lock-in point. Doakes tells Dexter directly that there's something off about him, calls him fake, calls him a creep, pledges to find out what Dexter is hiding. And from that moment, through all of seasons 1 and 2, Doakes never stops. He never gets distracted. He never loses focus. He's like a hunting dog that's caught a scent and will follow it until he drops. Doakes also recognized Dexter's fighting ability when they had a physical confrontation at the shipping yard. Dexter was supposed to be a lab geek, a quiet forensic analyst who spent his days looking at blood patterns and writing reports. When they scuffled, Doakes was surprised by how capable Dexter was in a fight. He even said it, "Lab geek, my ass." Doakes was gathering data points. Every interaction with Dexter gave him more evidence that the person standing in front of him was not who he claimed to be. The social mask, the practiced normalcy, the careful distance Dexter maintained from everyone around him. Doakes saw through all of it because he'd spent years in special forces environments where reading people accurately was the difference between living and dying. But nobody listened. The department dismissed him. His colleagues thought he had a personal grudge. The institutional culture of Miami Metro, which we'll talk about in a later theory, created an environment where the person raising legitimate concerns was treated as the problem rather than the person causing them. When Doakes finally gathered enough evidence to confront Dexter directly, Dexter didn't have a clever solution. He didn't outthink Doakes. He locked him in a cage, literally put him in a cage in a cabin in the Everglades, and kept him there like an animal while he figured out what to do. And before Dexter could make a decision, Lila West, the unhinged pyromaniac from season 2, blew up the cabin with Doakes inside. Doakes died in an explosion. And then, after his death, Dexter and the department framed him as the Bay Harbor Butcher. The man who had correctly identified a serial killer was posthumously branded as that serial killer. His reputation was destroyed. His legacy was erased. Everything he worked for, everything he risked, was turned upside down and used to protect the very person he had been trying to expose. What makes this even more infuriating is how the framing came together. The cabin where Doakes was killed was located on property owned by Juan Alonso, but it was rented not to Doakes, but to Santos Jimenez, one of the men who killed Laura Moser. Dexter had killed Jimenez previously, cutting him into 6 pieces with a chainsaw, the same way Jimenez had killed Laura. The connection between the cabin, Jimenez, and the Moser family murder was right there in the evidence, but instead of following that thread, the department wrapped it up neatly. Doakes was the butcher. Case closed. Promotions all around. The evidence planted against Doakes was circumstantial at best, but it didn't matter. The department wanted to close the case. The FBI wanted to close the case. The media wanted a name and a face and an explanation. And Doakes, who was dead and couldn't defend himself, fit the bill. He had a volatile personality, he had special forces training, he had the skills. Never mind that none of his colleagues, the people who worked with him every day for years, ever saw him exhibit behavior consistent with serial killing. Never mind that every confrontation Doakes had was with Dexter, the actual killer, and that his aggression was the natural reaction of a good cop who could sense something wrong but couldn't prove it within the system. The framing of Doakes is the show's clearest illustration of institutional cowardice. When given a choice between a comfortable lie and an uncomfortable truth, Miami Metro chose the lie. Every time. Without exception, and they called it justice. The only person who later questioned the official narrative was Maria Laguerta. In Season 7, Laguerta reopened the Bay Harbor butcher case because she never believed Doakes was guilty. She was Doakes' friend, she knew him, and she started connecting the dots. The blood slides, the boat movements, the timeline. Laguerta was doing exactly what Doakes had been doing. Following the evidence, trusting her instincts, getting closer to the truth. Laguerta's investigation is methodical and devastating. She discovers that the cabin where Doakes supposedly died wasn't rented to Doakes at all. It was rented to Santos Jimenez, one of the men who murdered Laura Moser. She learns from Matthews that both boys, Dexter and Brian, watched their mother get dismembered. She puts together the fact that the Bay Harbor butcher also dismembered his victims, that the butcher took blood slides just as Dexter, a blood spatter analyst, might. She reminds Matthews that Doakes always thought there was something off about Dexter. Every thread she pulls unravels the cover story a little more. And what does the department do? Matthews tells her to back off. He insists on handling Dexter himself because he's known him since he was a kid. When Laguerta pushes, Matthews accuses her of being blind to Doakes' guilt because of their close relationship. He flips the script on her. Instead of supporting her investigation, the institution uses her personal connection to Doakes as a reason to discredit her professional judgment, the exact same thing they did to Doakes himself. And what happened to her? She was murdered. Deborah Morgan shot LaGuardia in the Season 7 finale, inside a shipping container, to protect Dexter from being exposed. The location is significant. A shipping container, the same kind of space where Laura Moser was murdered. The same kind of space where Dexter's story began. The cycle of violence that started in a container ended another life in a container, and the victim was the last person in Miami Metro who cared about getting the truth right. Doakes said to Dexter, early in their encounters, something about there being something off about him. He called Dexter fake. He called him a creep. He pledged to find out what Dexter was hiding. And in another flashback scene, Doakes' suspicions were aroused when Dexter casually quoted a phrase from a journal kept by a murder suspect. When Dexter couldn't satisfactorily explain how he knew the quote, Doakes locked in. From that moment, he never let go. And the show treated that determination as a character flaw, as aggression, as paranoia. But reframe it. Imagine Doakes is the protagonist of his own story. A veteran soldier becomes a detective. He encounters a colleague who triggers every instinct he developed in combat. He investigates at great personal cost. He's right about everything, and he's murdered, framed, and forgotten. Doakes was the hero of Dexter, not Harry, not Deb. Doakes was the one honest man in a department full of people who couldn't or wouldn't see what was right in front of them. His murder isn't a plot convenience, it's the show's greatest tragedy. And the fact that the audience was conditioned to feel relief when he died, to see his removal as a problem solved rather than an innocent man destroyed, says something uncomfortable about how the show manipulated our sympathies from the very beginning. Before we get into the next theory, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss the rest of this breakdown. Now, let's talk about the woman who built the code. Not Harry. Harry was the face of it. Harry was the delivery mechanism. But the architect, the person who designed the framework from the ground up, was Dr. Evelyn Vogel. And if you look at her actual behavior across season 8, the story we're told about a compassionate psychologist helping a desperate father doesn't hold up under any scrutiny at all. Vogel is introduced in season 8 as a neuropsychiatrist who has spent her entire career studying psychopathic behavior. She's published books, she's lectured at conferences, she's consulted for law enforcement agencies, and when she reveals to Dexter that she helped Harry create the code, the show frames this as a revelation about Dexter's origin. A piece of history he never knew about, a window into the forces that shaped him. But look at what Vogel actually does in season 8, not what she says, what she does. Her arrival in Miami is orchestrated. She doesn't show up randomly. Deputy Chief Matthews introduces her to the homicide department as a consultant on a new case. A murder victim named Robert Bailey has had a section of his brain extracted, the anterior insular cortex, the part that processes empathy. The killer drilled into Bailey's skull post-mortem and removed it like a specimen. Vogel is intrigued. She suggests the killer was either experimenting or sending a message. And throughout the briefing, she keeps looking at Dexter. Masuka notices and tells Dexter that the FBI calls Vogel the psychopath whisperer. Dexter, understandably, wants nothing to do with her. But Vogel doesn't take no for an answer. She approaches Dexter while he's sitting on Maria Laguerta's memorial bench. He tells her it's not a good time. She leaves him a large envelope. Inside are gory drawings that Dexter made as a child. Drawings that he didn't know anyone had kept. Drawings that prove Vogel has been watching him, studying him, documenting him since he was a boy. Dexter chases her down, pins her against a wall, shows her the dangerous side of himself, demands to know what she wants. And Vogel, with the calm of someone who has spent decades around psychopaths and knows exactly how to handle them, says 4 words that stop him cold. I don't fit Harry's code. She knows the code, she designed it, and she knows that Dexter, despite his rage, won't violate it. She's betting her life on the system she built, and she wins the bet. Dexter releases her and walks away. That scene tells you everything you need to know about Vogel's relationship with Dexter. She's not afraid of him because she built him. She understands his programming because she wrote it, and she knows that the code will protect her from the very person it was designed to control. Vogel doesn't see Dexter as a person. She sees him as a product, her product, and products don't malfunction when you press the right buttons. She arrives in Miami because the brain surgeon, a serial killer who is targeting her specifically, has started leaving sections of human brains on her doorstep. She needs protection. She needs someone to find and eliminate this threat. And who does she turn to? Not the police, not the FBI, not any of the legitimate law enforcement resources available to a woman of her professional standing. She turns to Dexter, the serial killer she helped create. Vogel doesn't come to Miami to help Dexter, she comes to use him. She needs a killer, and she has one on speed dial, one she designed from childhood to follow orders as long as those orders come wrapped in the right justification. There's a moment later in season 8 that strips Vogel's motivations bare. Dexter breaks into the home of A.J. Yates, a former patient of Vogel's who has become the prime suspect for the brain surgeon killings. Yates has a secret lair with security cameras, and when Dexter discovers his computer, he finds Vogel's patient files stored on it. Dexter starts reading, and he finds his own file, Subject 0. The file reads, in part, that Dexter has somehow deluded himself into thinking his feelings for his sister are genuine, unaware there are no real emotions behind them. Vogel wrote that about Dexter. She documented him like a specimen. She reduced his love for Deb, the most human thing about him, to a clinical notation about self-delusion. She didn't see a man who loved his sister. She saw a psychopath who had developed a convincing simulation of love, and she found it academically interesting enough to write down. Dexter's reaction is immediate and violent. He advances on Vogel, accusing her of using him as a lab rat, of experimenting on him. He asks if she's keeping him and Deb apart as a way to isolate her subject. He warns her that when Yates is dead, she's out of his life forever. Or do you need to write it down, he says, throwing her own clinical detachment back in her face. This confrontation reveals the fundamental asymmetry of their relationship. Dexter thought Vogel was family. He described meeting her as like finding a family member. He told Hannah that Vogel created him, with something that sounded almost like gratitude. But for Vogel, Dexter was never family. He was data. The most successful data point in a decades-long research program, and the file, Subject 0, proves it. You don't assign numbers to your children, you assign numbers to your subjects. When Dexter accuses Vogel of this directly, when he says she's experimenting on him like a lab rat, Vogel's defense is revealing. She doesn't deny it outright, she reframes it. She calls her work with Harry a framework for Dexter's survival. She says that without the code, Dexter would have ended up in an institution or on death row. And that might be true, but framing her intervention as altruistic ignores the fact that Vogel got exactly what she wanted out of the arrangement. A living, breathing case study in managed psychopathy. A subject she could observe, document, and write about for decades. Vogel kept detailed video recordings of her sessions with Harry. These recordings, which Dexter discovers in Season 8, show Harry in obvious psychological distress. He's struggling with what he's doing to Dexter. He's questioning the code. He's showing signs of the guilt and horror that would eventually lead to his suicide. And Vogel, watching all of this happen in real time, never intervened. She never suggested Harry get therapy. She never recommended that they stop the program. She never prioritized Harry's mental health or Dexter's well-being over the continuation of her experiment. She just kept recording. In one of these recordings, Harry describes how teenage Dexter had just killed a drug dealer who had robbed and murdered 2 college kids. But Dexter did something new this time. Before he killed the man, he made him look at photos of his victims. Vogel interprets this as Dexter following the code, discovering an innate sense of justice. She's excited. She assures Harry that the process is working. Harry, meanwhile, looks like a man who is slowly drowning. He has doubts. He can see that the experiment is producing a functioning killer, but he's losing the ability to convince himself that this is a good thing. Later, there's another recording. Harry is describing how he caught Dexter dismembering a body. Plastic everywhere, blood everywhere, and Dexter was proud. Harry retorts that no one deserves to be in pieces, that he doesn't think he can live with it. Deborah, who watches this recording in Season 8, says exactly what the audience is thinking. And I'm supposed to? These recordings are damning because they show that Vogel had a front row seat to Harry's deterioration and did nothing to stop it. She had the opportunity at any point to tell Harry that the experiment was causing him psychological harm. She could have intervened. She could have recommended they change course. Instead, she kept the cameras rolling and the program running because the data was more important than the people producing it. And then there's the rule, the specific rule that Vogel added to the code that nobody talks about enough. Dexter learns in Season 8 that the first rule of the code, don't get caught, was Vogel's contribution. But there's a darker implication buried in that conversation. Vogel tells Dexter that she insisted on the don't get caught rule to give him a little wiggle room. She then asks Dexter why he didn't kill Deborah when Deb discovered his secret, since Deb's knowledge of his identity represented a threat to the code's first rule. Think about that. A psychiatrist, someone who is supposed to protect human life and well-being, built an escape clause into a teenager's moral framework that would allow him to murder innocent people if they discovered his secret. A genuine therapist would never construct a treatment protocol with a built-in justification for killing witnesses. That's not therapy, that's operational planning. Vogel was building a system that could sustain itself indefinitely by eliminating anyone who threatened its secrecy. Deborah confronts Vogel about this in Season 8, Episode 4. She accuses Vogel of defending Dexter because she created him and is using him to track a serial killer. Vogel doesn't deny it. She deflects. She redirects. She talks about Harry's good intentions. But she never actually refutes Deb's accusation because Deb's accusation is accurate. And the final piece of evidence is Vogel's own family. Her son Daniel became a serial killer, the brain surgeon, the very threat that brought Vogel back to Miami. Daniel drowned his brother Richard when they were children, and Vogel and her husband covered it up as an accident. They didn't get Daniel help. They didn't report what happened. They concealed a murder committed by their own child. The show reveals this gradually through Season 8. When Dexter discovers that a hair sample from the brain surgeon's crime scene is a familial match to Vogel, she initially resists the conclusion. She claims she has no family. Her husband is dead. Her sons are dead. But then the truth comes out. Daniel wasn't dead. He'd been placed in a mental health facility in England at age 14. At 17, he and 6 others were reportedly killed in a fire at the facility. But Daniel faked his death. He escaped, and he's been operating under aliases ever since, eventually arriving in Miami as Oliver Saxon. When Dexter ages a childhood photo of Daniel to approximate his mid-40s appearance, the facial comparison returns a 97.6% match to Oliver Saxon, the man who had been dating Cassie, Dexter's neighbor. The real Oliver Saxon died at age 10. Daniel Vogel stole a dead child's identity and used it to build an entirely new life as a serial killer. Vogel's reaction to Daniel's return is where the theory crystallizes. She refuses to let Dexter kill him. After decades of facilitating Dexter's kills, after building an entire system designed to point Dexter at targets and pull the trigger, Vogel suddenly discovers moral objections when the target is her own son. She wants to rehabilitate Daniel. She wants to try therapy. She wants to do all the things she never tried with Dexter. There's a scene where Saxon is having breakfast with Vogel at her house. She tells him it makes her feel like his mother again. Saxon retorts that she gave up that privilege a long time ago. When she offers to find care for him in a facility, Saxon refuses. He says he'll never be locked up again. And then he delivers the line that exposes everything about Vogel's character. He tells her that it's her fault he killed his brother because she ignored him and only cared about Richard. He's especially angry that she helped Dexter while he was rotting away in a psychiatric hospital with no visits from her. Think about what Daniel is saying. Vogel had 2 sons. One of them showed psychopathic tendencies. She institutionalized that son and never visited him. Meanwhile, she found another psychopathic child, Dexter Morgan, and poured years of attention, research, and intellectual energy into shaping him according to her code. She replaced her biological son with a research subject. She gave Dexter the care and structure she denied Daniel. And Daniel, abandoned and forgotten, became exactly what she should have expected: another killer. This selective application of her own principles proves what the theory suggests. The code was never about helping Dexter. It was never about channeling his urges productively. It was about control. When Vogel could control the situation, when the kills served her interests or her research, the code applied. When the situation became personal, when her own son was on the line, suddenly the rules changed. Dr. Evelyn Vogel didn't help Harry save Dexter. She designed an experiment. She used a traumatized child as her subject and a grieving, guilty father as her unwitting research assistant. The code isn't therapy, it's a research protocol. And Dexter was never Vogel's patient. He was her data. Subscribe if you haven't already, because the next theory is one that might change how you see one of the show's most beloved characters forever. Let's talk about Rita Bennett Morgan. Rita is the innocent. That's her role in the show. The sweet, kind, trusting woman who never suspected that her husband was leading a double life as a serial killer. The woman who loved Dexter unconditionally, who gave him a family, who represented the normal life he could never quite reach. And when Arthur Mitchell murdered her in the season 4 finale, leaving her bleeding out in a bathtub while their infant son sat in her blood, it was framed as the show's ultimate tragedy, the death of innocence. The moment when Dexter's 2 worlds collided, and the person who paid the price was the person who deserved it least. But go back and watch Rita's arc across all 4 seasons she's alive. Not as background decoration, not as Dexter's prop. Watch her as a character with her own observations, her own instincts, her own slow accumulation of evidence. And a pattern emerges that the show acknowledges but never fully explores. Rita noticed things. Before Dexter, Rita was married to Paul Bennett. Paul was an abuser, a drug addict, a man who hid his violence behind closed doors and presented a different face to the world. Rita lived with that deception for years. She learned through painful experience what it looks like when a man is keeping secrets. She understood the micro signs, the inconsistencies in stories, the late nights that don't add up, the energy shift when someone is lying to your face. Rita was trained by her first marriage to detect exactly the kind of behavior Dexter was exhibiting. And Paul tried to warn her. From prison, Paul told Rita directly that Dexter is not who you think he is. He said those words. Rita dismissed them because they came from an abusive ex-husband, and she had every reason to distrust anything Paul said. But Paul was right, not about the specifics. He didn't know Dexter was a serial killer. But the fundamental claim that Dexter was hiding something, that there was a version of him that Rita hadn't seen, was completely accurate. Rita found Dexter's second apartment, the one he kept separate from their family home, the one he used for kill preparation and planning. She confronted him about it, and Dexter came up with an excuse, and Rita accepted the excuse. But watch the scene carefully. She accepts it the way someone accepts an explanation they don't fully believe but aren't ready to challenge yet. The trust didn't break in that moment. It cracked. Throughout their relationship, Rita caught Dexter in lies repeatedly, his absences, his cover stories that didn't quite hold together, the NA meetings he attended under false pretenses because he was using Narcotics Anonymous as a cover for his kill schedule. Rita found inconsistencies and confronted them, and each time Dexter provided an explanation that was just plausible enough to buy him more time. But each lie, each excuse, each thin explanation left a residue. Rita's behavior in Season 4 reflects this accumulation. There's a moment in Season 4 that captures this perfectly. Dexter has been arrested after a road rage incident while following Arthur Mitchell. He punched out a mirror, confronted another driver, threw a phone, and got cuffed by local cops. Rita has to pick him up from jail. On the drive home, Dexter tries to explain. He says sometimes he's just going along and everything seems okay, and then this darkness creeps in and takes over. Rita says that makes him sound crazy, but she doesn't believe he is. She's trying to understand him. She's extending grace. She's doing what a good partner does when someone they love is struggling. But the scene reveals something else. Dexter isn't telling Rita the truth even in this vulnerable moment. The darkness he's describing isn't depression or anxiety or the aftermath of a bad day. It's the literal urge to kill people. And Rita, who is sitting right next to him, who is looking into his eyes, who is trying with everything she has to connect with her husband, has no idea that the darkness he's talking about has a body count. She's reaching for him. And he's letting her reach just close enough to feel connected, but never close enough to actually see. That's the cruelty of it. Dexter doesn't just lie to Rita. He lets her interpret his lies in the best possible light. He allows her compassion to become his camouflage. Every time she gives him the benefit of the doubt, she's unwittingly providing cover for his double life. Her love is the single most effective weapon in his arsenal of deception. And he wields it without ever acknowledging what he's doing. And the closer Rita gets to seeing the real Dexter, the more desperate Dexter becomes to maintain the illusion. The gap between who Dexter is and who Rita believes he is will eventually kill her. Not in years, in days. She becomes more anxious, more controlling, more focused on pinning Dexter down, knowing where he is, what he's doing, who he's with. The show frames this as Rita being stressed by motherhood and the pressures of a new marriage. But read it differently. Read it as a woman whose survival instincts, honed by years with an abusive husband, are firing on every cylinder. She can feel something is wrong. She can't articulate it. She can't point to a specific piece of evidence and say, this is what's off. But the cumulative weight of all those small lies, all those late nights, all those moments where Dexter's story didn't quite match the facts, is pressing down on her. Rita's increasing vigilance in Season 4 isn't irrational behavior, it's pattern recognition. The same pattern recognition that eventually saved her from Paul. The same instincts that told her something was wrong in her first marriage are telling her something is wrong in her second. She's not paranoid, she's paying attention. And then there's the question of how Arthur Mitchell found Rita. The Trinity killer tracked Dexter through his alias, Kyle Butler. Dexter had been using this fake identity to get close to Arthur, studying him, learning from him, admiring his ability to maintain a normal family life while being a serial killer. When Arthur discovered the deception, he traced Kyle Butler back to Dexter Morgan. And from Dexter, he found Rita. The way Arthur discovers Dexter's real identity is chillingly mundane. He simply looks up Dexter in the white pages. After all the elaborate cat and mouse between them, after all the mind games and surveillance, it comes down to a phone book. Arthur finds a listing for D. Morgan and laughs. He later breaks into Deb's apartment looking for more information, going through her mail, becoming furious when he realizes he's in the wrong Morgan's apartment. But the most devastating detail about Rita's death is the night before it happens. Dexter peels back the covers at Rita's side. He watches her sleep. He tells her they should go to the Keys tomorrow for their honeymoon and begs her to fly there with Harrison first thing in the morning. He promises he'll meet them after work. Rita isn't upset about the arrest. She's afraid of losing him. She tells Dexter that she accepts his demons, that she knows he can overcome them. She says she believes in him. Dexter kneels at her feet, buries his face in her lap, kisses her, and says he wants to be that man. He begs her to go first thing in the morning. Rita doesn't go first thing in the morning. She comes back home for something. And Arthur Mitchell is waiting. That night, Dexter finally kills Arthur. He thinks he's won. He thinks his family is safe in the Keys. He calls Rita's phone. She doesn't answer. He figures she's probably on the plane. He goes home to pack for the trip. And when he opens the bathroom door, he finds Rita in the bathtub. The water is red. Harrison is sitting on the floor in her blood. The scene is a mirror image of the shipping container, a child, a murdered parent, a pool of blood, and the man who caused it all standing in the doorway, understanding, too late, what his choices have cost. Dexter's own narration says something haunting in this moment. He talks about arriving at the house and seeing the flashing lights of police cars, about walking through the front door, about the officers' faces, about the sound of Harrison crying. He doesn't scream. He doesn't collapse. He picks Harrison up and walks outside, and the camera pulls back, and the season ends. Rita's death is a direct consequence of Dexter's double life intersecting with hers. She didn't die because she was in the wrong place at the wrong time. She died because Dexter brought a serial killer's attention to their family. He chose to study Arthur instead of killing him immediately. He chose his fascination with another killer over the safety of his wife and children, and that choice got Rita killed. There's also the matter of Rita's children, Aster and Cody. In the show, they're sent to live with their grandparents after Rita's death, largely written out of the narrative. But in the novels, something much darker happens. Dexter begins training them. He notices that Aster and Cody, products of Paul Bennett's abusive household, show early signs of the same darkness he carries. And he starts teaching them the code. The novels went further with this thread than the show ever did, but the implication is there in both versions. Violence doesn't just claim victims, it recruits them. Rita's children, touched by Paul's abuse and Rita's murder, are potential carriers of the same pattern. Dexter's own narration acknowledges this. He admits in his internal monologue that Rita's death is his fault, that he hesitated too long, that he let Arthur live when he should have acted. But even in that admission, Dexter frames it as a tactical error. He took too long, he miscalculated. He treats Rita's murder as a failure of strategy rather than a failure of character. But the theory goes deeper than that. The code says don't get caught. That's rule number 1, the rule that Vogel added specifically to give Dexter wiggle room. And Rita was getting closer to the truth with every passing day. Every question she asked, every lie she caught, every moment of doubt that clouded her face when Dexter gave her another excuse she couldn't quite believe. Rita was becoming a threat to the code, not consciously, not deliberately. But the trajectory was clear. She was a smart woman married to a man whose cover story was full of holes, and she was slowly, methodically, inevitably closing in on the truth. The show frames her death as tragedy. This theory frames it as inevitability. The code cannot coexist with an observant spouse indefinitely. Something has to give. And in Dexter's universe, the thing that gives is always the innocent person who got too close. Rita didn't die because she was ignorant. She died because she was starting to see. And the universe of the show corrected for that threat, not through Dexter's hand. He didn't kill her, but through the hand of the monster Dexter refused to eliminate in time. Arthur Mitchell was the instrument, but Dexter's double life was the cause. And somewhere, in some quiet corner of his psyche, Dexter knows that the woman who trusted him most was destroyed by the life he refused to give up. If you're listening to this and you haven't subscribed yet, now would be a really good time. We're about to get into the theory that explains why Dexter was never caught, and the answer isn't because he was smart. There's a question that hangs over the entire Dexter series that the show never adequately answers. How does a serial killer operate for over a decade inside the very police department that should have caught him? Dexter Morgan wasn't hiding in the shadows. He wasn't some unknown figure operating in the margins of society. He worked at Miami Metro as a blood spatter analyst. He had a desk in the homicide department. He had unrestricted access to crime scene databases, evidence rooms, forensic laboratories, and suspect lists. He used department resources to identify his victims. He attended crime scenes as part of his job and used the information he gathered there to plan his kills. He was, by any measure, the most inside threat imaginable, and for 8 seasons spanning well over a decade of in-universe time, nobody caught him. The standard explanation is that Dexter was clever, that he was meticulous, that the code's first rule, don't get caught, made him careful enough to avoid detection. And there's some truth to that. Dexter was careful. He used a boat to dump body parts in the ocean. He kept his kill tools hidden. He maintained a convincing cover identity as a quiet, socially awkward forensic analyst. But clever only gets you so far when you're committing dozens of murders over many years while working inside a police station. The real reason Dexter wasn't caught has nothing to do with his intelligence and everything to do with the institution that employed him. Miami Metro was systemically compromised. Not by corruption in the traditional sense, though there was plenty of that too. It was compromised by something more subtle and more dangerous. By the inability of an institution to investigate itself. By personal loyalties that overrode professional obligations. By a culture that valued comfort over truth. By the fundamental, structural incapacity of a closed system to identify a threat that exists at its center. Start with the Bay Harbor Butcher investigation in Season 2. Divers discovered Dexter's underwater graveyard. Dozens of dismembered victims in garbage bags dumped from a boat. The FBI is called in. Special Agent Frank Lundy, one of the most competent investigators in the show's universe, leads the case. And Lundy's profile is accurate. He determines that the Butcher is likely someone with law enforcement connections, someone with forensic knowledge, someone who understands police procedure well enough to avoid the standard investigative techniques. That profile describes Dexter perfectly, and Lundy comes agonizingly close to identifying him. Lundy is methodical, patient, brilliant. He doesn't rush, he doesn't make assumptions. He follows the evidence wherever it leads, regardless of institutional pressure or political convenience. He's everything Miami Metro's internal culture isn't. And yet even Lundy can't overcome the structural barriers that protect Dexter. The jurisdictional friction between the FBI and local police creates information silos. The need to maintain working relationships with Miami Metro means Lundy can't push too hard without losing cooperation. And the fundamental assumption, the assumption that sits at the core of every police department in the country, that your colleagues are the good guys, creates a blind spot large enough to hide a serial killer. Lundy returns in Season 4 to pursue the Trinity killer and is shot dead by Christine Hill. The FBI's best chance at identifying the Bay Harbor Butcher is eliminated not by Dexter, but by another serial killer's offspring. The irony is almost poetic. The investigator who nearly caught Dexter is killed by the daughter of the killer Dexter is currently studying. Then there's the moment in Season 7 when Deb discovers the truth. She finds Dexter's kill tools and blood slide box spread out on his coffee table. She asks him directly if he killed all those people. He says yes. She asks if he's a serial killer. He says yes. And in that moment, the last person inside Miami Metro who might have stopped Dexter instead becomes his protector. She doesn't turn him in. She doesn't call the police. She punches him in the face and leaves, and then slowly, agonizingly across the rest of Season 7, she is drawn deeper and deeper into complicity with his crimes. By the time she kills LaGuardia, Deb has crossed every line she ever drew for herself. She's become part of the system that protects Dexter, another person whose loyalty overrides their judgment, another casualty of the code's gravitational pull. But the investigation is hampered at every turn. Internal politics, jurisdictional conflicts between the FBI and Miami Metro. The assumption, never spoken aloud but always present, that a colleague couldn't possibly be responsible. And most critically, the institutional reflex to find the most convenient explanation and close the case. When Doakes was killed in the cabin explosion and evidence was planted suggesting he was the Butcher, the department accepted it. They accepted it with relief, because the alternative, continuing to investigate, following the evidence wherever it led, potentially discovering that the Butcher was someone they worked with every day, was too uncomfortable to contemplate. Doakes was the perfect scapegoat. He was aggressive, temperamental. He had a military background and a history of complaints. He fit a profile that was easy to believe and even easier to sell to the media and the department brass. Captain Tom Matthews is a perfect example of how personal relationships blinded the institution. When LaGuerta began investigating Dexter in Season 7, Matthews actively discouraged her. His exact words were, "If somebody's got to talk to Dexter, it's going to be me. I've known him since he was a kid." Matthews wasn't protecting the investigation, he was protecting a relationship. He had known Harry Morgan, he had watched Dexter grow up. The idea that Dexter could be a serial killer was, to Matthews, not just professionally inconvenient, but personally unthinkable. And that personal blind spot overrode his professional judgment. In fact, Matthews later visits Dexter on his boat to give him a heads up that LaGuerta thinks he's the butcher. Think about that for a moment. A senior police official tipped off a suspect that he was under investigation. Matthews sits Dexter down, lays out exactly what LaGuerta knows, the connection to Brian Moser, the similarity between the butcher's dismemberment method and what happened to Laura Moser, the suspicious link between the cabin renter Santos Jimenez and Dexter's mother, the blood slides, all of it. And instead of using this information to advance the investigation, Matthews is using it to give Dexter time to prepare. He's not even doing it maliciously. He genuinely believes he's helping a young man he's known since childhood, a young man who couldn't possibly be what LaGuerta is accusing him of. Dexter, of course, uses the warning immediately. He tells Deb that LaGuerta is closing in, and he needs to plant definitive evidence that Doakes was the Bay Harbor butcher. Deb insists on doing it herself because she doesn't want Harrison growing up without a father. So the daughter of the cop who created the code plants evidence to protect the killer the code produced, while the deputy chief who knew their father looks the other way. The entire chain of failure is built on personal loyalty, and Dexter's manipulation of evidence wasn't limited to the big moments. Throughout the series, he uses his position to subtly steer investigations away from himself. In Season 2, he hacks into Masuka's email and removes his alias from a list of people who obtained M99, the tranquilizer he uses on his victims. He plants evidence to redirect suspicion. He disposes of his weapons and tools when he feels the investigation getting too close, dumping them overboard from his boat. He even fabricates forensic evidence at crime scenes, planting dried blood to shift suspicion to other suspects. Every time the department's investigation comes within range of the truth, Dexter is there, inside the system, quietly adjusting the evidence trail. This is how institutional failure works. It's not one big decision, it's 1,000 small ones. It's the detective who doesn't pursue a lead because it would implicate a colleague. It's the captain who steers the investigation away from an uncomfortable direction because he's known the suspect's family for decades. It's the forensic analyst who has access to every piece of evidence and can subtly manipulate results without anyone questioning his work because they trust him. It's the culture that values loyalty over accountability, that treats suspicion of an insider as disloyalty rather than due diligence. Dexter didn't just benefit from this culture, he was a product of it. Harry Morgan was a cop. The code was designed by a cop's understanding of how police investigations work and where their blind spots are. The first rule, don't get caught, isn't generic advice. It's specific to someone who understands exactly how law enforcement operates and exactly where the gaps in that operation exist. Harry taught Dexter to exploit the system he himself worked in because he knew, better than anyone, how easy that system was to exploit. And Dexter exploited it with surgical precision. He kept his kill tools and blood slides inside a shipping container at Miami Shore's storage, a detail he acknowledges with dark irony by noting that it's appropriate because his dark passenger was born inside a shipping container. He maintained his boat, the slice of life, as his primary means of evidence disposal, dumping dismembered body parts in the Gulf Stream where the current would scatter them. He used his forensic expertise to manipulate crime scenes, his access to databases to vet potential victims, and his position of trust within the department to ensure that no one ever looked too closely at the quiet blood spatter analyst who always seemed to be around when things went wrong. The department didn't just fail to notice, they actively helped him without knowing it. When Angel Batista found Maria LaGuerta's old warrants to trace Dexter and Deb's phones, he ripped them up, not out of corruption, out of grief. He believed Maria's obsession with the case had gotten her killed, and he didn't want anyone else going down the same path. The people who loved LaGuerta, who mourned her death, who wanted to honor her memory, became unwitting participants in the cover-up that followed her murder. The system co-opted their grief the same way it co-opted everything else. Lagerta was the only person who ever reopened the case with genuine conviction. In Season 7, she started connecting the pieces that nobody else was willing to touch. The blood slides that were supposedly Doakes' trophies but matched Dexter's methodology. The boat movements that correlated with body dump locations. The timeline that didn't quite add up if Doakes was really the butcher. Lagerta was doing exactly what the system should have been doing all along, following the evidence, ignoring personal relationships, putting professional obligation ahead of institutional comfort. And the system destroyed her for it, not the official system. Dexter and Deborah destroyed her. Deborah shot Lagerta in the Season 7 finale to protect Dexter's secret. She killed a fellow officer, a woman who had been a mentor and a friend, to preserve the lie that had been holding the institution together since Season 2. The scene itself is worth examining closely because it illustrates how completely the code has corrupted everyone it touches. Dexter has lured Hector Estrada back to the shipping yard, back to the same kind of container where Laura was murdered. He uses Estrada as bait, having Estrada call Lagerta and tell her to come alone. Lagerta drives straight there, alone without backup, because she's that determined to finally prove what she knows is true. When she enters the container, she finds Estrada dead. Before she can react, Dexter injects her with M99 from behind. His plan is clean. Make it look like Lagerta and Estrada shot each other. Mutual kill. Case closed forever. But then, Deb arrives. She'd figured out what Dexter was planning. She begged him on voicemail not to do it. And now she's standing in the shipping container watching her brother prepare to murder a woman who was once her captain, her mentor, someone who supported her career for years. Lagerta wakes up. She sees Deb. She says 2 words that should have ended everything. She tells Deb to shoot Dexter. She calls Deb a good person. Dexter agrees. He drops his knife. He tells Deb to do what she has to do. And in that moment, standing between 2 impossible choices, Deborah Morgan shoots Lagerta. She runs to her side, sobbing, holding the woman she just killed. Afterward, Deb and Dexter walk through Angel's New Year's Eve party to establish an alibi, passing through a crowd of their colleagues, people who will never know what just happened in that container. Dexter thinks, in voiceover, that we all make rules for ourselves. It's not the rules that bind us, it's the choices we make. The location of Lagerta's murder is significant. She was killed inside a shipping container. The same kind of space where Laura Moser died. The same kind of space where Dexter's entire story began. The show may not have intended the parallel to be this precise, but the symbolism is unmistakable. The violence that started in a container ended another life in a container. The cycle that Harry's guilt set in motion claimed another victim in the exact same kind of space. And in Resurrection, years later, Angel Batista finally begins to piece together the truth. By then, Dexter has faked his death, lived as a lumberjack, resurfaced in Iron Lake, been shot by his own son, survived, and traveled to New York. The truth comes out decades too late. Not because the evidence wasn't there. The evidence was always there. It was there in Season 2. It was there when Doakes raised the alarm. It was there when Lagerta reopened the case. The truth came out decades too late because the institution designed to find it was structurally incapable of looking in the right place. The Bay Harbor butcher case isn't a story about a clever killer. It's a story about a broken system. Miami Metro didn't fail because they were stupid. They failed because the one place they couldn't investigate was themselves. And Dexter Morgan, trained by a cop to think like a cop, hid in the one place no cop would think to look: inside the machine. Before we continue, subscribe if you're not already. We're heading into the final stretch, and the last 2 theories are the ones that tie everything together. Let's talk about Harrison. The ending of New Blood is supposed to be redemptive. Harrison Morgan, Dexter's son, stands in the snow with a rifle. Dexter's in front of him. Harrison has discovered that his father killed Logan, the local police sergeant, an innocent man who didn't fit the code. Harrison has learned that the code has limits, that the rules can be broken, that the man who taught him right from wrong was never following those rules as strictly as he claimed. And so Harrison pulls the trigger. He shoots Dexter in the heart. Dexter collapses. He dies in the snow, telling his son he did good. The cycle of violence is broken. The son rejects the father's legacy, freedom. Except that's not what happened. Go back and trace Harrison's arc carefully. Not the story the show tells you, the actual sequence of events. Harrison was born in blood, found sitting in his mother Rita's blood in the bathtub after Arthur Mitchell murdered her. The show explicitly frames this as a mirror of Dexter's origin in the shipping container. 2 children, 2 pools of blood, 2 trajectories toward violence. In New Blood, Deb's ghost, functioning as Dexter's conscience, tells him directly that Harrison has inherited the Dark Passenger. But before we get to Harrison, we need to understand what Dexter was doing for the decade between faking his death and Harrison's arrival. After Deb's death, Dexter drove his boat into a hurricane, was presumed dead, and resurfaced in the small town of Iron Lake, New York. He adopted the alias Jim Lindsay. He got a job at a fish and game store run by a man named Fred. He started a relationship with Angela Bishop, the local police chief. He suppressed his killing urges for nearly 10 years. He fed goats. He attended community events. He played the role of a quiet, unremarkable small-town resident so convincingly that no one questioned him. For nearly a decade, Dexter Morgan didn't kill anyone. He lived without the code, without the Dark Passenger's demands being met, without the ritual, the plastic, the blood slides, and he survived. That detail alone undermines everything Harry ever told him. Harry said the urge couldn't be stopped, that it could only be channeled, that without the code, Dexter would self-destruct. But Dexter goes 10 years without killing and doesn't self-destruct. He struggles, certainly. Deb's ghost taunts him. He feels the pull, but he resists. He chooses not to kill for a decade, which means Harry was wrong. The urge can be stopped, it can be resisted, it can be managed through sheer willpower without a single dead body. Dexter proved it by living as Jim Lindsay for 10 years. And the only reason the killing starts again is because of 2 events that happen almost simultaneously. Matt Caldwell shoots a white buck and sprays Dexter with its blood, triggering a violent response that Dexter barely controls. And Harrison shows up at his cabin. Harrison's arrival is the catalyst. When Dexter opens the door and sees his son standing there, every structure he's built over the past decade begins to crack. Deb's ghost screams at him to send Harrison away. She tells Dexter that everyone close to him dies, that's why they're in Iron Lake, that Harrison will be safer with Hannah. Dexter lies to Harrison, claims he's not Dexter Morgan, gives him cash, suggests the shelter, tells him a bus is leaving town the next night, and Harrison leaves. But Dexter can't let him go. He watches Harrison walk away into the cold darkness through his window, and something inside him breaks. He burns a photo of himself with baby Harrison. He has nightmares. Deb is pulled into his ice fishing hole by an embodied Dark Passenger. And the next morning, when Matt Caldwell kills the white deer and celebrates over its body, spraying Dexter with blood again, the decade of restraint ends. Dexter snaps. He knocks Matt out. He sets up a kill room in his shed. He kills Matt Caldwell and claims his first victim in nearly 10 years. Harrison's return and Dexter's relapse happen within days of each other. The son's arrival triggers the father's darkness. The pattern recognizes itself and activates, and from that moment, Dexter begins training Harrison the same way Harry trained him. The cycle isn't restarting, it never stopped. It was just dormant. When Dexter searches Harrison's belongings, he finds a straight razor hidden inside a flashlight. This isn't a teenage boy's pocket knife. It's a weapon concealed with the same instinct for secrecy that characterized Dexter's youth. Harrison has been hiding his violent impulses the same way Dexter did. Not because he learned it from Dexter, who was absent for most of Harrison's life, but because the pattern replicated on its own. Then Dexter teaches Harrison the code. In New Blood, Episode 9, Dexter sits Harrison down and explains the framework. Find proof of the target's past crimes. Once you have evidence, you have justification to do what the law failed to do. Harrison compares Dexter to Batman. Dexter accepts that comparison. He teaches Harrison to shoot. He gives him a rifle for Christmas. He frames killing as heroism. And in the finale, Harrison applies the code perfectly. Not approximately, not in a distorted version. Perfectly. He discovers that Dexter killed an innocent person. Logan didn't fit the code. Dexter broke his own rules. And the code has a clear response to someone who violates it. Someone who kills outside the rules. Someone who represents a danger to others. you eliminate them. But the path to that moment is what makes it so devastating. Leading up to the finale, Dexter and Harrison have been working together to take down Kurt Caldwell, the local serial predator who has been kidnapping young women, hunting them through his property, and preserving their bodies in an underground display. Kurt's operation is monstrous, and taking him down feels justified. Harrison participates, he helps. He sees his father operate, and for a brief window, the code feels like it works. Father and son bonding over the elimination of a genuinely terrible person. But then things unravel. Angela Bishop has been doing her own investigation, connecting Dexter's injection sites on local drug dealers to the Bay Harbor butcher case in Miami. She discovers that Jim Lindsay, the quiet fish and game employee, might actually be Dexter Morgan, a man who was supposed to be dead. When she confronts Dexter when she presents her evidence, the walls start closing in, and Dexter responds the way the code taught him to respond when the walls close in. He kills Logan, not because Logan is a bad person, not because Logan fits the code, because Logan is between Dexter and the door. Because don't get caught takes priority over only kill bad people. Logan is collateral damage, the exact kind of innocent casualty that the code was supposedly designed to prevent. Harrison learns about Logan's death, and in that moment, every illusion shatters. Dexter rushes to meet Harrison, and Harrison sees blood on his father. He asks whose blood it is. Dexter says he'll explain everything later. Harrison realizes Dexter called him from Logan's phone. That Dexter killed Logan, and Harrison, the boy who was told his father only killed bad guys, who compared his father to Batman, who believed the code was righteous, discovers that his father is just a killer. The rules were never sacred, they were convenient. And when convenience ran out, the rules went with them. Harrison isn't rejecting the code when he shoots Dexter, he's executing it. He's applying the framework exactly as it was designed. The code says you kill people who have killed and will kill again. Dexter has killed, Dexter will kill again. Dexter is a threat. The logical conclusion of Harry's code, applied consistently and without sentiment, is that Dexter himself fits the criteria. Harrison pulls the trigger, not out of rage, not out of rejection, out of compliance. He's following the rules his father just taught him. He's being a good student. He's graduating. The final moments of the New Blood finale echo across the entire franchise. Dexter apologizes to Harrison for everything he's done. He tells Harrison he deserves a better life and a better father. He tells Harrison to take the safety off the gun. He says it's the only way out. He tells his son to shoot him in the heart. And Harrison does. Dexter collapses. With his final breath, he tells Harrison he did good. Deb, the ghost who has been his conscience throughout New Blood, holds his hand, but then pulls away as he dies. Even his own imaginary comfort abandons him at the end, and the aftermath proves it. Angela Bishop, the Iron Lake police chief, arrives at the scene. She sees Harrison standing over Dexter's body. She makes a choice that mirrors Harry's choice decades earlier. She lets Harrison go. She gives him cash, tells him to leave Iron Lake, tells him never to come back. She wipes down the rifle. She calls in the shooting as her own. Angela becomes Harrison's Harry. The person in authority who sees a damaged young person makes a judgment call about their future and sets them loose on the world with a secret and no accountability. Harrison drives away in Dexter's truck. He passes by Audrey's house and sees her in the window but keeps driving. Kurt Caldwell's bag of money sits on the passenger seat next to him. Dexter's letter to Hannah is in his hands. Police cars pass in the opposite lane, heading toward Iron Lake. Harrison drives in the other direction, toward whatever comes next. And what happens next? In Resurrection, Harrison is in New York. And he's killing. The cycle didn't break. It didn't even pause. It transferred. From Harry to Dexter to Harrison. 3 generations of men who kill and believe they're doing the right thing. 3 generations of men who were given permission to take lives by someone who told them it was justified. 3 generations of men who carry a dark passenger they didn't ask for but can't put down. Harry created a killer and called it the code. Dexter created a killer and called it parenting. And Harrison will create something too, eventually. A justification, a framework, a set of rules that makes the killing feel necessary, even righteous. The cycle doesn't break because the code isn't designed to be broken, it's designed to replicate. That's its function. Not treatment, not containment, replication. Every generation produces a new killer who believes they're the exception, who believes their violence is different, cleaner, more justified. Harrison believes he killed Dexter because Dexter was a bad man who broke the rules. But Harrison killed his own father. And the act of killing your own father, no matter the justification, is not the act of someone who has broken free from violence. It's the act of someone who has been consumed by it. Somewhere the dark passenger is settling into its newest host, whispering the same words Harry whispered to Dexter half a century ago. You're different, you're special, you can't help what you are, but I can teach you how to use it. Harrison didn't escape, he inherited. And we've arrived at the last theory, the darkest one, the one that, if you accept it, changes everything about every scene, every kill, every moment of internal monologue across 8 seasons of television. Make sure you're subscribed before we get into this, because once you hear it, you can't unhear it. The darkest theory about Dexter Morgan isn't about the dark passenger, it isn't about Harry's code. It isn't about the body count or the blood slides or the plastic-wrapped kill rooms. The darkest theory is the simplest one. Dexter Morgan was never a psychopath. He was a traumatized child who was told he was a monster by the people who should have helped him. And he believed them so completely that he became one. Not because he had to, not because he was destined to, because he was told he had no choice. Start with the diagnosis, or rather, start with the absence of a diagnosis. No clinical psychologist ever formally diagnosed Dexter Morgan as a psychopath. Let that sit for a second. Across 8 seasons, multiple prequels, and a sequel series, the character whose entire identity is built on being a psychopath was never actually diagnosed by a qualified professional using standard clinical criteria. The closest thing to a diagnosis comes from Harry and Vogel. Harry, a cop with no psychological training, observed his son killing animals and exhibiting emotional flatness. Instead of taking Dexter to a child psychologist, he consulted Vogel, a researcher who was more interested in studying psychopaths than treating them. Together, they decided Dexter was a psychopath. Based on what? On observations filtered through Harry's guilt and Vogel's professional ambition, not on clinical testing, not on a formal evaluation, not on a second opinion. In fact, Harry actively prevented Dexter from receiving a legitimate evaluation. In Season 2, Episode 4, Harry coached young Dexter to lie during a psychological assessment. He told Dexter what to say to appear normal. And when the doctor failed to identify anything wrong, Harry took that as proof that Dexter was a master manipulator rather than evidence that maybe, possibly, a trained psychologist saw a traumatized child rather than a psychopath. Think about what Harry did there. A doctor, someone with actual training and expertise, examined Dexter and found nothing pathological. And Harry's response was not relief but vindication of his own theory. The doctor can't see it because Dexter is that good at hiding it. Harry was so committed to his belief that Dexter was broken that professional evidence to the contrary only strengthened his conviction. And Dexter, who was a child, believed his father. Why wouldn't he? Harry was his whole world, the man who rescued him, the man who gave him a home. If Harry said he was a monster, then he was a monster. If Harry said the darkness was permanent, then the darkness was permanent. If Harry said the only option was the code, then the only option was the code. But the show gives us constant evidence that Harry was wrong, not ambiguous evidence, not hints. Direct, repeated, undeniable evidence that Dexter Morgan is capable of the one thing psychopaths definitionally cannot do. He forms genuine emotional attachments. Dexter loves Rita. The show doesn't frame this as imitation or mimicry. His grief at her death is real. It devastates him. It changes his behavior. It drives narrative decisions across an entire season. A psychopath who is merely simulating grief would not be affected the way Dexter is affected. His pain is genuine, and the show acknowledges it as genuine. Dexter loves Harrison. His relationship with his son is the emotional anchor of multiple seasons. His fear for Harrison's safety, his desire to protect Harrison from the dark passenger, his willingness to sacrifice himself in the New Blood finale, these are not the behaviors of someone incapable of emotional connection. They're the behaviors of a father who loves his child. Dexter loves Deborah. This is the relationship that defines the series more than any other. Dexter's bond with Deb isn't transactional. When Vogel tells Dexter that his love for Deborah is selfish, that he loves what Deb does for him rather than loving Deb herself. Dexter is shaken by this interpretation. And more importantly, his subsequent behavior contradicts Vogel's assessment. When Deb is shot by the brain surgeon, when she suffers a fatal stroke, when she's lying in that hospital bed connected to machines, Dexter disconnects the life support. He takes her body on his boat, he buries her at sea, and then he drives his boat into a hurricane and disappears. He doesn't do this because Deb's death is inconvenient. He does it because losing her destroys him. A psychopath doesn't destroy his entire life because someone dies. A person who loves someone does. But the complexity of the Dexter-Deborah relationship goes even deeper. When Vogel asks Dexter what he loves about Deb, he says he loves having steaks and beer with her, that she was always there for him the way she looked up to him. Vogel tells him none of that is about Deborah, it's about what she does for him. And that selfless love is hard enough for typical people and impossible for psychopaths. She says his attempts to help Deb are like Michelangelo trying to play the banjo, but Vogel is wrong, or at least she's applying a framework that doesn't fit the actual data. Because Dexter's behavior throughout the series consistently demonstrates that he puts Deborah's well-being ahead of his own interests. When Brian Moser, the ice truck killer, kidnaps Deborah in the season 1 finale, Dexter chooses Deb over his biological brother. He kills Brian to save her. A psychopath choosing a learned relationship over a blood bond is not consistent with any clinical model of psychopathy. When Deb discovers Dexter's secret in season 6, he doesn't kill her, even though Vogel's "don't get caught" rule would justify it. He doesn't even consider it. When Deb tries to kill them both by driving their car into a lake in season 8, Dexter isn't angry. He's hurt. He's confused. He wants to understand why, because he genuinely cannot comprehend a world where Deb doesn't want him in it. After Deb's death, Dexter's actions are not those of a psychopath cutting losses. He disconnects her life support himself. He wraps her body. He carries her to his boat. He takes her out to sea. And then he drives the slice of life directly into a hurricane. He's not fleeing. He's not running from consequences. He's destroying himself because the one person who made him feel human is gone. And without her, he doesn't know how to exist. Years later, in New Blood, Deb is his ghost, his conscience, the voice in his head that replaced Harry. Where Harry represented the code, Deb represents something messier and more honest. She calls him a monster. She tells him what Harry did was child abuse. She fights with him about every decision. She forces him to confront things Harry never would have. And Dexter keeps her there in his mind because he needs her. Not the way Vogel described, not as a mirror reflecting a positive image of himself. As the one person who saw everything he was and stayed anyway, until she couldn't anymore. Dexter forms connections with Lumen, with Hannah, even with his brother Brian during their brief reunion. He reaches toward human connection constantly throughout the entire series, like someone who is starving for something he was told he could never have. Lumen Pierce appears in season 5, a woman who was kidnapped, raped, and held captive by a ring of predators. Dexter rescues her. He helps her track down and kill the men who hurt her. And during this process, something happens that the show treats as significant. Lumen's dark passenger, the trauma response that drives her toward vengeance, fades when the last of her attackers is dead. She finds peace. She heals. She leaves Dexter peacefully with gratitude, having used violence as a temporary tool for recovery rather than as a permanent identity. Dexter watches Lumen leave and feels something he can't quite name. Envy, maybe, or recognition. Because Lumen's dark passenger was curable, it responded to resolution. When the source of her trauma was addressed, the darkness lifted. Dexter's dark passenger doesn't lift because Dexter's source of trauma was never addressed. The shipping container wasn't resolved. Laura's murder wasn't processed. Harry's response wasn't therapeutic. The darkness persists in Dexter not because it's permanent by nature, but because nobody ever gave it the chance to resolve. Hannah McKay is even more revealing. Hannah is a fellow killer. She murdered people, including poisoning Dexter's own sister. She's dangerous. She's manipulative. She's everything the code says Dexter should eliminate. And Dexter falls in love with her anyway, genuinely, desperately, completely falls in love with a woman who is, by any rational measure, the worst possible partner for him. He chooses Hannah over the code. He plans to flee the country with her. He imagines a life in Argentina where they raise Harrison together, a family of damaged people trying to build something normal out of the wreckage of their pasts. A psychopath doesn't do this. A psychopath doesn't plan a future. A psychopath doesn't sacrifice security for love. A psychopath doesn't look at another person and think, I would rather be with you and at risk than safe and alone. Dexter's relationship with Hannah is messy, complicated, and ill-advised, but it's also undeniably real. He loves her. He trusts her. He makes plans with her that extend beyond the next kill, beyond the next crisis, into an imagined future that has nothing to do with the code or the dark passenger. Hannah represents the life Dexter could have had if anyone had ever treated his trauma as a wound rather than an identity. Simply put, Psych published an analysis in 2025 that argued Dexter's traits align more closely with PTSD from his mother's murder and antisocial personality disorder, not psychopathy. The critical distinction is this: PTSD and antisocial personality disorder can produce many of the behaviors Dexter exhibits: the emotional flatness, the difficulty with social cues, the attraction to violence, but neither condition means a person is incapable of empathy or destined to kill. These are treatable conditions. They respond to therapy. They can improve with intervention. Dexter never received therapy. He received kill training. A Medium analysis from 2025 put it bluntly. Biology or trauma didn't make Dexter a killer. Harry did. And there's research to support this. Studies on childhood psychopathy, or more accurately, children who exhibit psychopathic traits, consistently show that early intervention and intensive therapy can produce significant positive outcomes. Children who are labeled as psychopaths and treated accordingly tend to become psychopaths. Children who are identified as traumatized and given appropriate support tend to recover. Harry didn't give Dexter support. Harry gave Dexter a knife and a set of rules and the unshakable belief that he was broken beyond repair. And Dexter, who was a child, who trusted his father, who had no other framework for understanding himself, accepted that identity completely. In Resurrection, something happens that should rewrite everything we think we know about Dexter Morgan. He prioritizes saving a potential victim over making a kill. The show specifically notes that this is something his dark passenger has never seen before. Dexter chooses mercy over violence. He chooses someone else's life over his own compulsion. His empathy, his capacity for genuine moral choice, surfaces in a way that surprises even the darkness inside him. This moment is significant because of what it implies about every moment that came before it. If Dexter can choose mercy now, in Resurrection, after surviving a gunshot from his own son, after losing everything, after being stripped of every relationship and every structure that defined his life, then the capacity for mercy was always present. It wasn't added later. It wasn't developed through personal growth. It was there from the beginning, buried under the code, suppressed by Harry's conditioning, overridden by the programming that told Dexter his only value was as a killer. In Resurrection, Dexter's in New York, he's tracking Harrison, he's grappling with a spectral projection of Harry that functions differently from the Harry ghost of the original series. This Harry is more confrontational, more honest, less invested in maintaining the mythology of the code. And Dexter, for the first time in his life, is operating without a safety net. No department to hide inside, no Deb to anchor him, no kill table, no plastic wrap, no ritual to contain the chaos. He's just a man in a city trying to find his son. And in that stripped-down state, Dexter does something he's never done. He puts someone else's survival ahead of his own need. The dark passenger notes this with something approaching confusion. The programming says, kill. The man says, wait, and the man wins. Not because the dark passenger has been defeated, not because some dramatic transformation has occurred, but because in the absence of all the structures that reinforced his identity as a killer, Dexter's buried humanity surfaces just enough to override the impulse, which means the empathy was always there. It was never absent. It was suppressed, buried under layers of conditioning, under Harry's code, under Vogel's research framework, under decades of being told that feelings were a mask, that love was imitation, that the darkness was the only real thing about him. Dexter's emotional capacity wasn't destroyed by the shipping container, it was buried there. And Harry and Vogel piled more dirt on top of it every year for the rest of his life. Go back to that conversation one more time. Season 7, Episode 10, the full exchange is worth walking through because every line in it matters. It starts with Dexter telling Harry's ghost that he has proof of the arsonist's guilt and his urges are beyond his control. Harry says, "You're dark passenger. Where did you come up with that anyway?" Dexter is surprised by the question. He says he thought he got it from Harry. Harry corrects him, "I gave you the code. The dark passenger was all yours." This is Harry's ghost distinguishing between what was taught and what was invented. The code came from Harry and Vogel. The dark passenger, the name for the compulsion, the mythology around the darkness, that came from Dexter himself. A 12-year-old boy gave his trauma a name and nobody corrected him. Then Dexter says the line that opens the entire conversation. "You said it got into me too early in that shipping container, like you thought I was possessed." And Harry responds, "I meant you were traumatized, Dexter, not possessed. I remember the first time you said it. You must have been about 12. I just let it go. I couldn't let you blame yourself for feelings that were too complicated for a young boy to understand. But you're not a boy anymore." Harry let it go. A 12-year-old boy created a fantasy entity to explain his violent impulses, to externalize the thing inside him that frightened him. And Harry, instead of correcting the fantasy, instead of saying, "Actually, that's trauma, not a passenger, let's talk about it," Harry let it slide. Because the dark passenger served the code. If Dexter believed the darkness was a separate entity, something that couldn't be reasoned with or treated, only managed, then the code was the only possible response. The dark passenger wasn't just Dexter's coping mechanism, it was Harry's too. Dexter pushes back. "Maybe the dark passenger is just a feeling," he says, echoing what Hannah McKay has been telling him. And then he delivers the most vulnerable line he's ever spoken. "It can't be." Why? Because if there's no dark passenger, then I'm responsible for everything I've done. That's the real cage, not the code, not the ritual, not the plastic wrap and the kill table. The cage is the belief that the dark passenger is real, because if it's real, then Dexter is a host, a vessel, a victim of circumstance. He didn't choose this, it was done to him. He can't help it. The darkness is its own entity, and Dexter is just along for the ride. But if the dark passenger is just a feeling, just a name a scared 12-year-old gave to the screaming pain inside his chest, then Dexter Morgan is not a vessel. He's a person who made choices, over 100 choices to end someone else's life. And every one of those choices was his. Harry's ghost says, "It's much scarier to think that the dark passenger is no more real than I am." The dark passenger might not be real. It might be a story, a narrative that a traumatized child created to explain feelings he couldn't process, and that the adults in his life reinforced because it was easier than facing the truth. Easier for Harry, who couldn't admit that he'd turned his son into a killer. Easier for Vogel, who couldn't admit that her experiment was built on a false premise. Easier for Dexter, who couldn't bear the weight of responsibility for over 100 deaths if there was no dark passenger to blame them on. Because that's what Dexter says. He says it out loud. "If there's no dark passenger, then I'm responsible for everything I've done." And that thought is so terrifying, so annihilating, that Dexter would rather believe he's possessed by an ancient darkness than accept that he had a choice, that he always had a choice, that every person he killed was killed not by a monster but by a man who was told from the age of 10 that killing was his destiny. Over 130 people died at Dexter Morgan's hands across 8 seasons. Every one of those deaths was justified by a code created by a corrupt cop and a morally compromised psychiatrist. A code taught to a child who was never given the chance to be anything other than what they made him. Dexter Morgan wasn't born a monster, he was manufactured. And the manufacturing process was so thorough, so complete, so integrated into every aspect of his identity that even Dexter himself couldn't see it. He spent his entire life believing he was fundamentally broken, that the darkness was innate, that the code was mercy. It wasn't. The code was a cage built by guilty people who couldn't face what they'd done to a 3-year-old boy in a shipping container full of blood. Harry couldn't face it, so he killed himself. Vogel couldn't face it, so she called it science. And Dexter couldn't face it, so he called it the dark passenger and let it drive, for decades, through over 100 kills, through the destruction of every person who got close enough to see the truth. Think about the people who paid the price for Harry's guilt and Vogel's ambition. Brian Moser, abandoned at 4 years old, left to rot in an institution, eventually killed by the brother he was separated from. James Doakes, a good cop and a war hero, blown up and framed as a serial killer for the crime of being right. Rita Morgan, a sweet woman who survived one abusive marriage only to be murdered by the collateral damage of her second husband's secret life. Maria Lagerta, shot in a shipping container by her own protege for reopening a case that should never have been closed. Deborah Morgan, who carried the weight of her brother's secret until it crushed her, who killed for him, who died because of him, who loved him so fiercely that it destroyed every other part of her life. Deb's arc across the series is maybe the clearest evidence of the code's corrosive effect on everyone it touches. Before she discovers Dexter's secret, Deb is a rising star. She's brash, foul-mouthed, emotionally transparent, and relentlessly determined. She becomes a detective, she earns promotions, she falls in love, she makes mistakes, but they're her mistakes, and she owns them. She's the most alive character in the entire show. And then she walks into a church in the season 6 finale and sees her brother plunging a knife into Travis Marshall's chest. Everything changes. The Deborah we know, the one who follows her gut and says what she thinks and lives out loud, begins to disappear. In season 7, she's consumed by what she knows. She tries to control Dexter. She tries to redirect him. She uses her position as lieutenant to cover for him. Every decision she makes is now filtered through the lens of her brother's secret, and every filter removes a little more of who she used to be. By mid-season 8, Deb is drinking heavily, using drugs, making reckless decisions at work. She's been staying at Vogel's house to manage her PTSD symptoms, and during this period she watches one of Vogel's old recordings of Harry. In the video, Harry describes walking in on Dexter dismembering a body. Harry says he doesn't think he can live with it. Deb watches this and says, simply, "And I'm supposed to?" That's the question the show never answers adequately. Harry couldn't live with what he created, so he killed himself. But Deb, who inherited Harry's burden without ever choosing it, without ever having a say in any of it, is expected to endure. She's expected to carry the weight of being the sister of a serial killer, the killer of a captain, the protector of a monster, without any of the support or context that might have made it bearable. And in season 8, episode 4, Deb tries to kill them both. She's driving. Dexter's in the passenger seat. They're having a conversation about Vogel, and without warning, Deb jerks the steering wheel and sends the car into a lake. The car sinks. A fisherman swims out and saves Deb. Dexter is left unconscious in the submerged vehicle, and for a moment, Deb stands on the bank and watches the car go under. She watches her brother drown. And then she jumps back in and saves him. That sequence, the impulse to kill followed by the refusal to let it happen, encapsulates Deb's entire relationship with Dexter. She wants to destroy the thing that's destroying her, and she can't, because she loves him. Because whatever Harry did to Dexter, whatever the code did to their family, the bond between Dexter and Deb is the one genuinely human thing that survived it all, and it's killing her. Deb eventually dies in season 8. Shot by the brain surgeon, fatal stroke, life support. Dexter disconnects her, buries her at sea, drives into a hurricane, and the character who was once the show's brightest light, the most authentically human presence in a story full of manufactured identities, ends her life as collateral damage in someone else's experiment. Logan, who was killed for being in the wrong place at the wrong time, who didn't fit the code but died anyway because the code was never really about justice. It was about Dexter's survival, and survival, Harry taught him, comes first. All of them, every single one, are casualties of a decision Harry Morgan made when he looked at a traumatized child and saw a monster instead of a boy. When he chose training over therapy, when he chose the code over a chance at normalcy, when he decided, based on nothing more than his own guilt and a researcher's curiosity, that this child was beyond help. What if he wasn't? What if there's a version of Dexter Morgan who sits in a therapist's office at age 10 and talks about the nightmares? Who processes the trauma of the shipping container with a trained professional instead of a hunting knife? Who learns that the darkness he feels isn't a passenger? It's pain, and pain can be treated, not eliminated, not channeled into murder, treated like any other wound. What if Harry had taken both boys from that container? What if Brian hadn't grown up alone in an institution, forgotten and abandoned, left to process the worst day of his life without anyone who cared whether he survived it? What if Brian and Dexter had been raised together, two brothers who shared the same trauma, who could have leaned on each other instead of becoming each other's enemies? The ice truck killer exists because Harry Morgan looked at a 4-year-old and decided he wasn't worth saving. Brian Moser's entire criminal career is a consequence of that one decision at the shipping container. What if Vogel had used her expertise to heal instead of study? What if she'd looked at young Dexter and seen a patient instead of a research subject? What if she'd recommended therapy, real therapy, with a clinician who specialized in childhood trauma? Not the code, not a system designed to channel murder into acceptable targets. Actual psychological treatment, the kind that's been shown in study after study to help children with behavioral problems develop into functional, nonviolent adults. What if Dexter had grown up knowing his own story, knowing that his mother was murdered, that he witnessed it, that the pain he felt was a normal response to an abnormal situation? Knowing that the darkness wasn't destiny, that it was grief, that it was rage, that it was a 3-year-old boy's mind trying to make sense of something that no mind at any age should ever have to make sense of. That version of Dexter doesn't exist. Harry made sure of that, and the darkest thing about Dexter Morgan isn't any of the 130 people he killed. It's the person he could have been if anyone had bothered to ask whether a 3-year-old boy sitting in his mother's blood might just need someone to hold him and tell him it was going to be okay. Nobody asked. Nobody looked at that child and saw a child. Harry saw a project. Vogel saw an experiment. And Dexter, who was 3 years old when the world ended and has been trying to put it back together ever since, saw exactly what they told him to see. A monster staring back at him from the mirror every day for his entire life. And the rest is history. Blood-soaked, plastic-wrapped, ocean-dumped history. And that's where we land. 8 theories, 8 ways of looking at the same story and seeing something different from what the show wanted us to see. Harry wasn't a hero. The dark passenger might be a lie. Doakes was the only honest man in the room. Vogel was running an experiment, not a therapy practice. Rita was killed by proximity to truth. Miami Metro failed because institutions always fail when they can't look inward. Harrison didn't break the cycle, he completed it. And Dexter Morgan, the character we spent 8 seasons rooting for, might have been a normal man who was never given the chance to find out. Every theory we covered tonight connects to every other one. Harry's guilt created the code. The code created Dexter. Dexter created a body count. The body count required a cover-up. The cover-up required a scapegoat. The scapegoat was an innocent man. The one person who tried to set the record straight was murdered, and the son who was supposed to end the cycle became its newest chapter. It's one story, told across decades, across generations, across shipping containers and kill rooms and bathtubs full of blood. A story about what happens when guilty people try to manage trauma instead of healing it. When institutions protect their own instead of protecting the truth. When fathers pass their damage to their sons instead of doing the hard, terrifying work of breaking the chain. The darkest Dexter theory isn't that he's evil, it's that he didn't have to be. And nobody, not Harry, not Vogel, not a single person in his entire life ever told him that. Not until it was far, far too late. Thanks for sticking with this one. If you made it this far, you're exactly the kind of viewer who'd enjoy what we do here. Subscribe if you haven't already. Leave a comment with which theory hit the hardest. And I'll see you in the next one. Sleep well.